Picture this: a frozen German warehouse on the outskirts of Berlin, January 1945. Inside, 3 ordinary-looking American artillery shells rest on an examination table. To most observers, they're just standard munitions, the kind that had been falling on German positions for months. But to Dr. Hinrich Becker, chief engineer at Germany's primary weapons testing facility, these shells represent something far more terrifying than high explosives. They represent proof of a truth so devastating that acknowledging it would shatter everything the Third Reich claimed to believe about German superiority. Within hours, Becker would hold in his hands the mathematical evidence of Germany's inevitable defeat, and within days that evidence would be buried, dismissed and ignored by the very people who needed to see it most. The story begins not with grand battles or dramatic turning points, but with a peculiar mystery that German soldiers couldn't explain. Throughout December 1944, during the desperate German offensive in the Ardennes, frontline troops began reporting something impossible. American artillery shells were detonating in mid-air with uncanny precision, showering shrapnel downward in lethal patterns that made foxholes and trenches utterly useless. Soldiers who had survived years of combat on multiple fronts, men who knew every sound and pattern of artillery warfare, were encountering something entirely new, something they couldn't understand or counter. The reports flooding back to German command were consistent and disturbing. Shells that seemed to sense the ground beneath them, explosions that occurred at the perfect height to maximize casualties, a weapon that eliminated the basic defensive tactics infantry had relied upon since World War I. At first, commanders dismissed these accounts as combat stress or exaggeration. Artillery doesn't explode with perfect timing in blizzard conditions with poor visibility. It was physically impossible to calculate airbursts with such consistency when even determining basic range was difficult in those conditions. But the reports kept coming, and the casualty figures were undeniable. Someone high in the German command chain made a decision. They needed to understand this weapon. More specifically, they needed to know if it could be countered, replicated, or somehow neutralized. 3 unexploded American shells, carefully recovered from the frozen ground near Bastogne, were transported under heavy security to the Heerversuchsanstalt Kummersdorf, Germany's most sophisticated weapons research facility. There, they landed on the desk of Dr. Hinrich Becker, a man whose engineering expertise was about to lead him to conclusions his superiors would find intolerable. Becker approached the examination with the methodical precision of a man who understood that artillery shells, even duds, could kill you if handled improperly. One mistake, one accidental trigger, and he'd be scattered across the warehouse in pieces. But curiosity and duty drove him forward. His hands were steady as he began the delicate process of disassembly, photographing each step, documenting every detail. The outer casing was unremarkable, standard American production, well made but nothing extraordinary. The rifling marks told him these shells had definitely been fired from artillery pieces, subjected to the tremendous forces of launch. He carefully removed the nose cone, expecting to find a conventional timed fuse or perhaps a simple contact detonator. What he found instead made him stop breathing for a moment. Nestled inside the nose of the shell was a device so unexpected, so seemingly impossible, that Becker simply stared at it for several long seconds, his mind racing to comprehend what he was seeing. It looked like a miniature radio set, compact, precisely machined, with components arranged with obvious sophistication. But that couldn't be right. Radio equipment was fragile. It required careful handling and stable mounting. The idea of putting radio components inside an artillery shell that would experience forces of 20,000 times gravity during firing was absurd. The components would shatter instantly. The vacuum tubes alone would disintegrate. Yet here it was. And the rifling marks on the shell casing proved this impossible device had survived being fired from a gun. "Headman," Becker called to his assistant, an electrical engineer named Franz Weber who'd worked for Telefunken before the war. "Come look at this. Tell me what you see." Weber approached the table, leaned over to examine the exposed mechanism, and his expression shifted from curiosity to confusion to something approaching disbelief. His voice was uncertain when he finally spoke. That appears to be a radio transmitter and a receiver. and what looks like an amplification circuit. But Herr Doctor, this can't be right. These components shouldn't survive being fired from a gun. The forces involved would destroy them. But they did survive, Becker said quietly, pointing to the rifling marks. This shell was fired. It traveled through a gun barrel at high velocity, subjected to enormous acceleration. Somehow impossibly, this radio equipment not only survived the launch, but remained functional enough to serve its purpose. The two men looked at each other, and in that moment they both understood they were looking at something that represented a significant leap beyond German capabilities. Over the next several hours, as Becker and his team carefully documented every component, the full picture emerged with terrible clarity. This wasn't just a radio, it was an entire system, miniaturized and ruggedized to an extraordinary degree. There was a vacuum tube smaller than anything in German production, a battery system with an ingenious activation mechanism, a tiny antenna designed to deploy after firing, a trigger circuit connected to the main explosive charge. Each piece was a marvel of engineering in itself. Together, they formed something revolutionary. The function became obvious as they mapped out the circuitry. This was a proximity fuse. The device transmitted radio waves continuously after the shell was fired. When those waves reflected back from the ground or a target, the changing frequency would trigger detonation at the optimal altitude for an airburst. No calculations required, no timing needed. The shell itself decided when to explode based on its distance from the ground. It was brilliant, it was elegant, and it was absolutely terrifying in its implications. Becker sat back from the examination table, his mind working through what this meant. The technical achievement was stunning, certainly, but it was what the achievement revealed that truly shook him. Every component of this device represented sophisticated manufacturing capability. The miniaturized vacuum tubes alone suggested production techniques Germany didn't possess. The ruggedization required to make electronic components survive artillery launch implied quality control standards and testing procedures far beyond what German factories, increasingly bombed and staffed by forced labor, could maintain. But there was more. Much more. "How many of these do you think exist?" Becker asked his team. The question hung in the air. Finally, Fauber answered, his voice grim. "Based on the reports from the Ardennes, thousands at minimum, possibly tens of thousands. They're using them as standard ammunition across entire artillery batteries." Becker did a quick calculation in his head. Each fuse required dozens of precision components: vacuum tubes, resistors, capacitors, custom batteries, antenna assemblies, all manufactured to exacting specifications, all miniaturized to fit in an artillery shell. And the Americans were producing them in massive quantities, distributing them to frontline units, expending them as readily as conventional ammunition. The implications cascaded through Becker's mind like falling dominoes. This wasn't just a new weapon. This was evidence of an industrial system operating at a level that seemed almost incomprehensible. Germany was struggling to produce basic ammunition in sufficient quantities. Meanwhile, America was mass-producing miniature radar sets sophisticated enough to guide individual artillery shells to their optimal detonation point. What else were they producing at this scale? What other technological advantages existed that Germany hadn't even encountered yet? Becker called a meeting with his senior engineering staff. These were men who'd spent their careers developing weapon systems, men who understood the relationship between design sophistication and manufacturing capability. He laid out his findings with clinical precision, holding nothing back. "Gentlemen," he began, "we are looking at a functional miniature radar set designed to survive being fired from an artillery piece. The Americans have solved problems we've been struggling with for years. The question before us is simple. Can we replicate this technology?" The discussion that followed was one of the most sobering conversations Becker had ever participated in. Every engineer present could appreciate the brilliance of the American design. Every engineer also understood with crushing certainty that Germany couldn't build it. Not now, possibly not ever given current constraints. Dr. Wilhelm Schaefer, who specialized in electronics production, shook his head slowly. The miniaturization alone is beyond our current capabilities. Our vacuum tubes are too large and too fragile. To create tubes this small while maintaining functionality and survivability would require manufacturing precision we simply do not have. And even if we could make one, scaling to mass production would be impossible given our resource constraints. Another engineer pointed to the materials analysis report. Look at this. The casings are high-grade aluminum alloys. The circuitry uses copper with no signs of material substitution or quality degradation. Every component is built to specifications we can no longer meet consistently. This isn't just about design sophistication. It's about having unlimited access to quality materials and the manufacturing infrastructure to work with them precisely. The room fell into a heavy silence. Finally, Becker asked the question that had been haunting him since he first opened the shell. If they're producing these in the quantities the battlefield reports suggest, what does that tell us about American industrial capacity? The silence deepened. These were men who understood manufacturing, who could extrapolate from a single product to the systems required to produce it. They were doing those calculations now, and the results were devastating. Hedman Furber spoke first. Herr Doctor, each of these fuses requires precision manufacturing across multiple disciplines: electronics, metalworking, chemical engineering for the batteries, quality control systems to ensure they work reliably. If they're producing tens of thousands of these, that implies production infrastructure on a scale that... He paused, searching for words. On a scale we haven't properly understood. An older engineer, a man who'd worked in German industry since before World War I, leaned forward. With respect, Herr Doctor, I think we're all underestimating the magnitude of what we're seeing. If American industry can mass-produce something this complex while simultaneously producing aircraft, tanks, ships, and conventional munitions in overwhelming quantities, then their industrial capacity doesn't just exceed ours. It exceeds anything we've imagined. The gap isn't one we can close through better design or more efficient production. The gap is categorical. Becker knew the man was right, and that knowledge led him to make an unusual request through intelligence channels. He needed to see the broader picture of American production capacity. He needed data beyond just this one weapon system. 3 days later, he sat in a secure conference room with classified intelligence reports spread across the table. What he read confirmed his worst fears and exceeded them in ways he hadn't anticipated. The American Proximity Fuse program, codenamed VT for variable time, had been enormous. Intelligence suggested it was one of the largest wartime development projects, comparable in funding to the atomic bomb program itself. The development had taken place at Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Laboratory, involving hundreds of scientists and engineers working in coordinated teams. The resources devoted to this single weapon system were staggering, but it was the production figures that made Becker feel physically ill. By late 1944, American factories were producing approximately 40,000 proximity fuses per day. Per day. That was more sophisticated electronic devices than Germany's entire electronics industry could produce in a month. And these weren't simple devices. Each one was more complex than most radios, more sophisticated than many of Germany's most advanced instruments. The Americans were producing them at automotive production speeds, treating high-technology electronics as if they were interchangeable parts. Becker pulled out German production statistics for comparison, and the numbers were brutal. In 1944, Germany had produced approximately 40,000 aircraft total for the entire year. The Americans were producing more proximity fuses than that every single day, and fuses were just a small fraction of America's overall war production. The intelligence reports contained other disturbing information. The proximity fuses had first been deployed in anti-aircraft roles in 1943, achieving remarkable success rates against Japanese aircraft and German V-1 flying bombs. They'd been kept secret from ground combat specifically to prevent capture and reverse engineering. The fact that they were being used in the Battle of the Bulge meant one of two things. Either the Americans were desperate enough to risk the secret, or they were so confident in their industrial advantage that compromise no longer mattered. Becker suspected it was the latter. His suspicion was confirmed by another document, a British intelligence assessment of American industrial capacity that made for truly sobering reading. The United States was... Becker wasn't surprised by the dismissal. He'd seen this pattern repeatedly throughout the war. The regime had built itself on premises of German racial and technological superiority. Admitting that America had surpassed Germany in industrial and scientific capability would undermine the entire ideological foundation the Third Reich rested upon. But reality doesn't adjust itself to ideology. The shells kept falling. The mathematics remained unchanged. Becker's report may have been dismissed by high command, but it reached some field commanders, and their response was very different. A colonel commanding an artillery regiment on the Western Front requested a meeting. The man had the haunted look common among officers who'd been in combat too long, who'd seen too many men die. "Herr Doctor," the colonel began, "I read your report on the American fuse. I need to know if your conclusions are accurate, because what my men experienced at the Bulge..." He paused, struggling with the memory. "We lost an entire battalion in minutes. Not hours, minutes. The survivors described shells exploding above them with perfect precision, said there was nowhere to hide, no defense that worked. I thought they were exaggerating. That combat stress had distorted their perceptions." "They weren't exaggerating," Becker said quietly. "Everything they described is consistent with how this weapon functions." The colonel's hands clenched. "Herr Doctor, I've been a soldier for 20 years. I fought in Poland, France, Russia, North Africa, Italy. I faced every type of weapon. But this changes the fundamental nature of ground combat. How do you train soldiers to survive a weapon that makes every defensive position useless? How do you maintain unit cohesion when men know that foxholes and trenches offer no protection?" Becker had no answer, because there wasn't one. The proximity fuse had fundamentally altered the calculus of infantry warfare. Tactics developed over centuries were suddenly obsolete. The colonel continued, his voice carrying the weight of certain knowledge. "And if your report is accurate about American production capacity, if they're making these by the tens of thousands every day, then every position we hold, every attack we launch, will be met with this weapon. We'll be ground down piece by piece, with no way to counter it." He met Becker's eyes. "The war is over, isn't it? Not officially, not yet, but mathematically, strategically, it's finished." "Yes," Becker confirmed simply. After the colonel left, Becker sat alone in his office, thinking about all the brilliant German engineers and scientists who'd developed remarkable weapons during the war. The V-2 rocket, technologically decades ahead of anything else. The Me-262 jet fighter, the first operational jet in combat. Advanced tanks like the Tiger and Panther. Sophisticated submarines with snorkels and improved torpedo systems. Technical marvels, all of them. But they were marvels produced in small numbers, often too late, always in insufficient quantities to affect strategic outcomes. Germany had focused on quality and sophistication, while America had mastered quantity and reliability. In an industrial war, quantity was its own form of quality. 1,000 adequate weapons deployed today were worth more than 10 perfect weapons deployed next month. The proximity fuse exemplified this principle perfectly. It wasn't the most sophisticated device possible. German engineers could probably design something more elegant, given unlimited time and resources. But the Americans had designed something good enough, reliable enough, and had figured out how to produce it at scale. That combination was unbeatable. And it wasn't just weapons. American superiority extended to logistics, training systems, communication networks, medical care, everything. They'd created an integrated industrial war machine that was greater than the sum of its parts. After the war, when production figures were declassified, Becker learned that his estimates had been conservative. He'd actually underestimated American capability. The final production total for VT proximity fuses exceeded 22 million units. 22 million sophisticated electronic devices, each containing miniaturized radar components, all produced in less than 2 years of full-scale manufacturing. To put that in perspective, Germany's entire production of all types of fuses for all munitions during the war was roughly 500 million units. But those were simple mechanical or timed fuses, not complex electronic systems. The Americans had produced 22 million smart fuses while also producing hundreds of millions of conventional fuses for other applications. The cost of the VT fuse program exceeded $1 billion in 1940s currency, comparable to the Manhattan Project. But unlike the atomic bomb, which was used only twice, the proximity fuse was deployed in massive quantities and had direct, measurable impact on battlefield outcomes across multiple theaters. General George Patton, after witnessing the fuse's effectiveness during the Battle of the Bulge, wrote that it won the battle for us. He later stated his belief that the proximity fuse was one of the three most important developments of the entire war, alongside the atomic bomb and radar. The British, who received large quantities of VT fuses through Lend-Lease, conducted their own analysis. Their conclusion: the proximity fuse increased anti-aircraft artillery effectiveness by a factor of 5 and ground artillery effectiveness by a factor of 3. In practical terms, every shell with a VT fuse was worth 3 to 5 conventional shells. This force multiplication effect, combined with America's already overwhelming production advantage, created a situation where German forces were simply buried under an avalanche of firepower they couldn't counter, match, or survive. Becker survived the war and was interrogated by American technical intelligence officers. They were particularly interested in his 1945 report. "Did you really conclude from examining these fuses that Germany had lost the war?" an American officer asked. Becker nodded. "Not from the fuses alone, but from what they represented. The ability to mass-produce complex electronics during wartime suggested industrial capacity on a scale we couldn't approach. Every component, every specification required resources and manufacturing capability that Germany lacked and couldn't acquire." "But you were examining captured ammunition," the officer pressed. "Surely you couldn't extrapolate the entire strategic situation from that." "I could and did," Becker replied. "When you see a single component of your enemy's supply chain, and that component is more sophisticated than your most advanced weapons, and it's being produced in quantities that exceed your total output of similar items, the strategic conclusion becomes inescapable. It's basic mathematics." The American officer made notes. "We found your report in German archives. It was marked defeatist assessment, no action required. Did that surprise you?" Becker smiled bitterly. "No. In the Third Reich, accurate assessment of material disadvantage was considered treason. The ideology required belief in German superiority, regardless of evidence. When reality contradicted that belief, reality was dismissed." "So you knew your report would be ignored?" "I knew. But as a scientist, as an engineer, I couldn't remain silent about what I'd discovered, even if no one wanted to hear it." The story of Hinrich Becker and the VT fuse is a microcosm of Germany's larger strategic failure. Time and again, competent professionals presented accurate assessments of Germany's deteriorating position and were ignored, dismissed, or punished. Admiral Canaris warned about American industrial capacity and was eventually executed. Albert Speer understood Germany couldn't win a production war, but remained silent until it was far too late. Adolf Galland recognized American aircraft superiority and was called a defeatist. Gerd von Rundstedt knew the Ardennes offensive would fail for lack of fuel and was ignored. Erwin Rommel understood the Atlantic Wall couldn't stop an invasion and was forced to commit suicide. Now Becker joined that tragic list. An engineer who examined captured technology, reached accurate conclusions about strategic reality, and was dismissed because that reality contradicted Nazi ideology. When confronted with evidence that those myths were false, the evidence was rejected. Maintaining ideological purity was more important than acknowledging strategic reality, even when that refusal guaranteed catastrophic defeat. This willful blindness extended to the proximity fuse's tactical implications. Even after German forces had been decimated by the weapon at the Bulge, even after thousands of soldiers had been killed by airbursts they couldn't defend against, High Command refused to acknowledge that this represented a fundamental shift in warfare. Some generals insisted it was just a lucky weapon that German soldiers would adapt to with proper training and discipline. Others claimed the reports were exaggerated, that battle stress was causing troops to overstate the fuse's effectiveness. The idea that America had developed and deployed a genuinely revolutionary weapon in massive quantities was too threatening to the regime's self-image to accept. But the soldiers knew. Every German infantryman who survived an artillery barrage in 1945 learned to fear the American shells that exploded overhead. Foxholes, the basic defensive position that had protected soldiers since World War I, were now death traps. Men who'd survived years on the Eastern Front, who'd endured some of the most brutal combat in human history, found themselves helpless against a weapon that eliminated their fundamental survival tactics. There was no defense, no counter, no training that helped. You simply hoped the shells fell somewhere else. Becker's report had predicted exactly this. He'd written that the fuse eliminates the primary means by which infantry survive artillery bombardment. What haunted Becker in the years after the war was how obvious the conclusion should have been. The numbers were available through intelligence channels. The evidence was clear and unambiguous. Germany was fighting an industrial war against an enemy with overwhelming material superiority, and no amount of tactical skill, operational brilliance, or ideological fervor could overcome that mathematical reality. The proximity fuse was just one example among many. American production statistics were available and should have been impossible to ignore. The United States produced over 300,000 aircraft during the war. Germany produced about 94,000. American shipbuilding exceeded that of all other nations combined. American munitions production was so vast that allies like Britain and the Soviet Union were supplied with American equipment even while US forces fought on multiple fronts across the globe. The arithmetic was brutal and inescapable. Germany was outnumbered, outproduced, and increasingly outperformed technologically. The sophisticated weapons Germany did produce, like the Me-262 jet or the Type 40 submarine, came too late and in too few numbers to affect outcomes. Meanwhile, America was producing millions of trucks, billions of rounds of ammunition, and yes, 22 million proximity fuses. The scale of American production was so vast that waste became acceptable, even expected. American forces could afford to expend ammunition at rates that would bankrupt the German war economy. They could lose equipment and replace it within days. They could take casualties and have them replaced with well-trained soldiers. The material advantage was so overwhelming it made tactical considerations almost irrelevant. Becker had seen this disparity crystallized in those 3 captured shells on his examination table in January 1945. Each one represented a triumph of miniaturization, precision manufacturing, quality control, and mass production. Each one proved that America had achieved industrial sophistication that Germany couldn't match. And there were millions more where those came from, with more being produced every single day. The VT proximity fuse stands as one of World War II's most significant, yet least publicly known technological achievements. It saved thousands of Allied lives by defending ships from air attack and devastating German ground forces at critical moments. But from the German perspective, it was something else entirely, a revelation of just how comprehensively outmatched they were. Not outmatched by a small margin that skill and determination could overcome, but fundamentally, categorically, mathematically outmatched by an industrial system operating at a scale they hadn't properly understood and couldn't begin to approach. Hinrich Becker was one of many German professionals who saw this truth and tried to communicate it up the chain of command. Like the others, he was ignored, dismissed, and marginalized. The cost of that blindness was catastrophic beyond measure. The war continued for 4 more months after Becker submitted his report. Hundreds of thousands more died in combat. Millions more were displaced. German cities were reduced to rubble. The Holocaust continued operating at full capacity until Allied forces physically shut it down. All of this suffering was inflicted in service of a cause that multiple competent professionals had already concluded was mathematically impossible to achieve. The lesson extends far beyond World War II. When ideology becomes more important than evidence, when loyalty is valued over accuracy, when uncomfortable truths are suppressed rather than addressed, catastrophic failure becomes not just possible, but inevitable. Organizations that punish bearers of bad news guarantee they'll receive only good news, even as reality deteriorates around them. Becker's examination of those 3 artillery shells should have triggered a fundamental reassessment of Germany's strategic position. Instead, it was filed away, marked as defeatist and forgotten. The smart weapons kept falling from the sky. The arithmetic of defeat continued its inexorable calculation, and the Third Reich marched toward its inevitable end, blind to a reality it had refused to see. The proximity fuse changed warfare forever, ushering in the age of guided munitions that continues to this day. But its examination by German engineers in that frozen warehouse revealed something even more important: the fatal consequences of valuing ideology over truth, of choosing comforting myths over uncomfortable mathematics, of building systems that punish accurate assessment. In the end, reality doesn't care what you believe. It doesn't negotiate or compromise. It simply is. The smart shells proved that beyond any doubt, one precision airburst at a time, raining down consequences on those who chose comforting lies over difficult truths. And somewhere in the ruins of Berlin, Dr. Hinrich Becker looked at the smoking rubble and knew he'd been right. The knowledge brought him no satisfaction whatsoever.